So this lecture this is where you're going to start to see a lot of stuff that you will see on that lab practical test, okay? So this lecture and the cerebrum lecture are the two big ones where this is where you're going to see a lot of the material that's going to, and the same pictures that you're going to see on these, the same you'll be seeing on that lab practical exam. All right, start easy. Brainstem, 3 main parts: medulla, pons, and midbrain, going from bottom to top. Medulla, pons, and midbrain. So here's a nice little cleaned off brainstem with no cranial nerves except for a little trochlear sneaking around the back here to distract you, okay? It does have, looks like a few fibers of cranial nerve number 5 there too. So let's go in and look at this. So you have the one picture on the left, which is a little cleaner than the other picture on your right, which is actually from your lab handbook that has that picture. So these two pictures you could see, any one of these from the front part of the brainstem, these are the pictures you would see to identify objects. So let's just go ahead and identify a few structures here that are important. Let's start with start at the top and work our way down. So right here, from the outside, looking at these structures here, and you can see kind of the fibers there. Here it is on this side. I'm going to kind of show on both sides here. Cerebral peduncle. Okay, cerebral peduncles for both of them together. Bumps right here and bumps right here are the mammillary bodies. Yeah. Yes. Crus cerebri. Yep. And then here is the interpeduncular fossa. That's a space, fossa, space, interpeduncular fossa. And I just point that out because here's your oculomotor nerve coming out here. It's torn off on this side, but your oculomotor nerves come out of the interpeduncular fossa. Well, stay up top here. If you're curious, this right here, this structure here, that's the optic tract on both sides. Going back to your lateral geniculate nucleus back here. So this is actually, this picture is actually cut all that off, okay? And then here's your A is the optic nerve. This is the optic nerve on, and then this is the B is the chiasm. Let's erase some of this stuff. Work our way down. So this entire region right here, front part here, that's called the basilar pons. So this whole region would be called the basilar pons. The reason it's called the basilar pons is because there's this little region right here is the basilar groove. Basilar groove, because your basilar artery lies in that groove. Hence basilar groove, hence basilar pons, because of the basilar artery that runs and lies in that spot. Go down to the medulla. This right here, from right here, what you can see left over here, this would be considered kind of middle cerebellar peduncles. Okay. However, I typically wouldn't ask that from this view. I would, if I'm going to ask you a cerebellar peduncle, I'm going to look at the back of the brainstem where you can actually see where those have been cut off, and you can see the distinction between middle, superior, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. But that's kind of where those are mainly the middle cerebellar peduncles coming off there. Moving down into the medulla. So we have this region here on each side. Those are the pyramids from the outside. And then just lateral to that is the olives. On this side, you have the pyramids here. The olives are kind of hidden back here behind these cranial nerves, all these little cranial nerve fibers that are sticking out. There's a cranial nerve coming from, this is the cranial nerve, this is trochlear nerve coming from the backside, wrapping around the backside of the brainstem there. It's trochlear nerve. Here's the most medial cranial nerve right here at the pontomedullary junction. Okay, that's going to be our abducens. Is that cranial nerve number 6 right there? Oh, here's cranial nerve number 5 and some of its fibers right here. Cut tag end of cranial nerve number 5. Then as we move more laterally, we have usually cranial nerve number 7 and then cranial nerve number 8. When you get into here, I have to go back and look whether this is 9 or 10. But things just start getting ripped off here. This is actually part of spinal accessory nerve, so there's little fibers coming up from the cervical area, and this is going to go up inside the foramen magnum and dive back down. Spinal accessory nerve. These little fibers right here that are coming out of, this is called the ventro-intermediate sulcus on the medulla. That's going to be that's going to be hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12. If I'm gonna circle or have you identify cranial nerve, I'm gonna make sure it's pretty clear for you. I'm not gonna try to get into some of this mess in here to try to trick you or anything like that to pick out a nerve in there. It'll be one of those more easily identifiable cranial nerves. Now we're on the back side of the brainstem. Let's just work our way down that. So this bump right here you're seeing, that's the back part of your thalamus. It's actually called the pulvinar of your thalamus. I don't want you to worry about it, I just want you to note, because your thalamus is right here and right here, okay? It's sitting just above your brainstem is where your thalamus is sitting, that's up inside of your cerebrum there, but that's what I want you just to see. There. Here's our corpora quadrigemina, our 4 bodies, which is then we have our top up here is superior colliculus and then inferior colliculus on both sides. And remember, just deep to those are some motor fibers that are for helping us innervate the muscles that go to our tectospinal tract. This is the tectum, or the roof of the midbrain, that help reflexively orient our head and eyes to visual and auditory information. The superior colliculus is more for eye movement. You know, you see something in your periphery and your eyes shift over that way. That's driven by superior colliculus. Just deep to the superior colliculus is where some motor fibers that go to the oculomotor nerve to help drive your, and also down through the medial longitudinal fasciculus if you also turn your head to that side, to the neck muscles via the tectospinal tract to make you turn your head to that side as well. And then that's the same thing with the inferior colliculus, okay? For the hearing part of it, okay? For auditory signals that make you want to turn your head and eyes. Because remember that medial longitudinal fasciculus is that tract that runs down here between your superior inferior colliculi and between your vestibular nuclei and your tectospinal tracts, vestibulospinal tracts, all that is mediated by connections between that medial longitudinal fasciculus. So you sync up your eye, head, neck movement. Okay, they all work together. Here's that trochlear nerve coming out the back. And remember, the trochlear nerve crosses over midline, is the only cranial nerve that crosses midline and comes out the back of the brainstem. Now let's take a look at, now we're down in the pons here. Okay, this is the pontine region right here. Back of the pons, cerebellum used to be back there. We pulled the cerebellum off, okay? We have this little structure here. When you pull that off, it leaves this depression called the rhomboid fossa, because it's got that rhomboid shape to it. It's the rhomboid fossa. This one's got this little membrane here. This picture, they've cut that membrane away, so it gives you a little more definition of seeing the full extent of that rhomboid fossa. The rhomboid fossa, if you remember, it forms, it's the floor of our fourth ventricle. You know, in order to have a fourth ventricle, you got to have a cerebellum. The cerebellum forms the roof of your fourth ventricle. The rhomboid fossa is the floor of the fourth ventricle. Even though it's located in this position, you know, when you're standing upright, but that's considered still the floor or the front part of your fourth ventricle there. Cerebral spinal fluid inside of that. Let's take a look at where we cut the cerebellum off. That's going to help us define our, on this side, this is going to be superior colliculus, not superior cerebellar peduncle, middle cerebellar peduncle, and inferior cerebellar peduncle. The nice part about the way I do the lab practical now is that you'll see one of those circled like that, so it's a little easier to define which one I'm trying to get you to look for. Okay. On this side, they cut it a little differently. That would be your middle, superior, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. On this particular way they've cut it, superior cerebellar peduncle, middle, and then inferior here, inferior here. This is where those cerebellar peduncles are. Back here, so now let's get in the medulla here. Let's start medulla. We have a couple structures that are important. We have a couple bumps more medial, right at the bottom. Here's the inferior kind of angle of the rhomboid fossa, but just now right here, that's going to be your gracile tubercles, right? Gracile tubercles from the outside. Just deep to that is your gracile nucleus. And then just lateral, there's another bump here, another bump there. Those are the cuneate tubercles. Just deep to that is the cuneate nucleus. That's where those first and second order neurons are going to meet for the dorsal column medial lemniscal system. This is where they're going to synapse for, you know, the gracilis is the lower body, cuneatus upper body. Extending, there's a little line right there you can kind of see. Here's this posterior median fissure here. There's another little line right there. There's another little depression or line there. Another one right there. That divides us into, you know, our, I'll kind of connect these all together here. We've got our most medial is going to be now fasciculus gracilis, and then we have fasciculus cuneatus, a little more lateral. They call it the fasciculus from the outside, but you also, if you look at it in cross-section, it's also called the fasciculus. It doesn't change names whether you see it from the outside versus the inside. And that's what they're trying to show here, is these fasciculus, tubercle, gracile tubercle, cuneate tubercle, and then X and Y. X would be your fasciculus gracilis, and Y would be your fasciculus cuneatus. That little spot where it becomes now you have your cerebral aqueduct, that's called the obex, but you don't need to know that. That's just a curiosity thing, obex. One thing I forgot to show you on this side that could be on the exam, on the front part, is right here, and I would draw it like this. This little crosshatch is here, and it would be right in this area right here. That would be the decussation of the pyramids, or the pyramidal decussation. That's where those cortical spinal tract fibers are coming and crossing over in that pyramidal decussation. Yeah?
Just I wanted to clarify something. Did you say that for the superior filters, that it was for the eye, and the inferior is for the
Yes. Yes, yep. And I kind of think my eyes are a little higher than my ears, so that helps me a little bit, although I don't know if in reality that's true or not. Pretty close. Okay, so that's the outside of the brainstem. Now we're going to go inside the brainstem. Okay. This is stuff you've all heard or we've talked about already. So the brainstem, it's amazing the stuff that's going on in this brainstem, but there are vertical tracts that either run through the brainstem or stop in the brainstem. Okay? You have sensory, motor, and autonomic vertical tracts that run through or connect to the brainstem. Some go through relatively unaltered. They just go right on through the brainstem. They're just passing along to another place to go to, and they don't make a lot of connections in the brainstem. So things like the spinal thalamic tract, bringing in pain and temperature from your body, it runs up through the brainstem as the spinal lemniscus. Remember what's in the brainstem is called, but it tends to run through fairly unaltered, go right up to your thalamus and then to your cortex. Okay, spinal thalamic. Same thing with medial lemniscus, sensory tract, runs through the dorsal columns, becomes a medial lemniscus in the brainstem. It runs through the brainstem relatively unaltered. There is a sympathetic pathway called the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, the DLF. This is what runs from your hypothalamus down through your brainstem, down to drive sympathetic fibers from that T thoracic, T1 to L1, L2 region, okay? It's going to communicate with those sympathetic fibers to drive sympathetic control, because that's your hypothalamus is your master controller. So there's an actual tract called the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus that runs down your brainstem down to the thoracic spine to go communicate with your sympathetic nervous system, but also some of that extends all the way down to the parasympathetic fibers coming out of your sacrum, right? You've got a few parasympathetic fibers coming out of your sacral segments. The dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. That runs relatively unaltered. It runs right down through your brainstem to go to the sympathetic control. And then also parasympathetic for the sacral division. And then you have your cortical spinal tract, the tract that goes from your brain down through your brainstem, crosses over at that pyramidal decussation to go to drive especially distal control of our limbs, voluntary distal control of our limbs, okay? Some vertical tracts have some decent amount of synapses or connections within the brainstem itself. They stop there, they make connections there. So these would include the spinocerebellar tracts. Even though they technically don't go to the brainstem, a lot of times the cerebellum is considered essentially a functional part of the brainstem because it's sitting off the back of it. So these spinocerebellar tracts, our unconscious proprioception, go into the brainstem and they stop, but they stop in the cerebellum. So not purely a brainstem connection, but they end at the level of the brainstem. your cortical bulbar tracts. The cortical bulbar tracts are the cortical fibers that are for voluntary control of cranial nerve nuclei, motor nuclei for facial expression, tongue movement, swallowing, and those kind of things, the more voluntary part of that. So that's the cortical bulbar tracts. And the cortical bulbar tracts start with your cortical spinal tract, your cortical bulbar tracts all run together from the cortex down through the internal capsule and then down into the midbrain, in the front part of the midbrain, but then the cortical bulbar tracts they cross over and they just stop at the cranial nerve nuclei for muscles, movement of your face and neck and tongue. But the cortical spinal tracts just keep on going because they're going to go down to your spinal cord to tell your limbs what to do. Okay? We have cortical pontine fibers. If you remember the cortical pontine fibers, what they do is in the front part of your pons, that's where your motor stuff is running, but they stop in a little collateral. They stop at the pontine nuclei. At the pontine nuclei then cross over and send a copy of whatever motor signal you were sending to that cerebellum on the opposite side. So this is how you get that copy. One of the copies, there's a couple copies you get to your cerebellum, but this is one way when you're sending motor signals down the front part of your pons, some of those motor signals stop and tell the pontine nuclei, which then have an axon that crosses over to the other side to the opposite side of the cerebellum, what is happening with what you intend to do. These are the motor signals I'm going to be sending down to through my cortical spinal fibers. I'm going to send some copies, and that's through the cortical pontine fibers. Okay. Then we also have cortical reticular fibers. So these are cortical fibers that go down to the reticular formation. This can be for influencing motor activity. Remember I was talking about like somebody gets stressed and anxious and has the yips, or you tighten up. That's because you have cortical drive from the limbic system down to these reticular formation areas. And the reticulospinal tracts, the medial activation system, makes you stiffen up or tighten up when you're nervous or anxious and those kind of things. Those are cortical reticular fibers. Okay? But remember, all this stuff, the cortical bulbar, cortical pontine, cortical reticular fibers, all kind of start kind of in the same region in the cerebrum, all run together, but just a matter of some of them stop in the pons, some of them stop in the reticular formation, but some of them keep going and become cortical spinal fibers. Then we actually have vertical tracts that start in the brainstem. They originate in the brainstem itself. So these are all of our brainstem, mainly medial activating systems: tectospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal. Those three are the medial activating system pathways that start in the brainstem. Okay. We have a rubrospinal tract that starts in our brainstem. It's considered a lateral activating portion, even though it starts in the brainstem, because it's going more to distal flexors of the upper extremities. Then we have the cerebello and raphe spinal tracts, which are primarily descending pathways for pain modulation and pain control, if you remember. Okay, and we're going to review that again here in a second. So these are all the pathways that originate in the brainstem itself and influence either motor or pain modulation mainly. So this is a nice just drawing here, or this is a sagittal section through the brainstem. All the stuff here, for vertical tracts that run through the brainstem, most of the motor tracts for the brainstem, vertical tracts in the brainstem run down the front part of the brainstem if it's a vertical tract. So you can see these red fibers are all motor tracts. They're all running together up here, but then some of them stop in the cortical pontine or cortical bulbar fibers or cortical reticular fibers. Those stop there. Okay? Then some keep going on as cortical spinal fibers, but motor tracts are towards the front part. If it's a vertical tract that's going to pass through your brainstem, it tends to be towards the front part of the brainstem. And then your sensory tracts tend to come up the back part of the brainstem. Okay, vertical tracts that go up for sensory information tend to come up the back part of the brainstem. Okay. So we're going to stay on this, looking at the brainstem in a sagittal section, and talk about these longitudinal sections to the brainstem, these regions, longitudinal regions when you look at it in a sagittal view. So there is what's called the basilar portion, which is the front part of the brainstem. So there's really not a basilar portion of the midbrain and the medulla. However, we can kind of say there is. We have the basilar pons, but if we want to kind of take this front part, this whole front region here, of the pons, the front part of the midbrain and the front part of the medulla, this is where you have those vertical tracts running that are primarily motor in nature. Primarily motor, cortical bulbar, cortical spinal, cortical pontine, cortical reticular fibers. They're all running down through this front part of the brainstem. Okay? We're making stops. Cortical pontine, cortical reticular, cortical bulbar to different cranial nerve nuclei, making those stops along the way. That's the basilar section, basilar and longitudinal section through the brainstem. Then we have this, all this right here, this rest of this part of the brainstem right here is called the tegmentum. The meaty center, I guess you would say, of the brainstem is the tegmentum of the brainstem. The tegmentum is where you're going to see more of your sensory tracts, more sensory tracts going up the back part here of the tegmentum. All of your cranial nerve nuclei, for the most part, are somewhere located in this tegmentum. Okay? When we get to the cross sections, you'll see where the cranial nerve nuclei, they tend to all be in this big meaty center of the tegmentum. This is also where your medial longitudinal fasciculus lies, that connection between the superior and inferior colliculus, the vestibulospinal tracts, and all that stuff. That is in that tegmentum. And then we also have running throughout most of the entire tegmentum, and right kind of in the center of it is this area called the reticular formation. And then lastly, for longitudinal sections, most posterior is just the tectum. This is the tectum, which is just that superior and inferior colliculus, and it's only in the midbrain. Tectum means roof, so it's forming a roof over the midbrain. So those are the three longitudinal sections and what's primarily in those sections. Now we're going to specifically take a look at this reticular formation that we just talked about and get into that reticular formation and talk about its functions, and it can be subdivided into some longitudinal sections itself. So what is this reticular formation? It's a complex neural network in the tegmentum. Tons of interneurons in there. It modulates a lot of stuff. It modulates a lot of things with pain control and also basic alertness, awareness, consciousness, and also some basic functions as far as cardiorespiratory and cardiac and respiratory centers are in there too. So it has three longitudinal zones. But we're going to, these longitudinal zones for the reticular formation, we're going to look at it from a anterior-posterior view, not a sagittal view, okay? So now we're going to look at the back of the brainstem, and this whole region in here is all reticular formation, which is all in the tegmentum of the brainstem, but it's more in that center part of the tegmentum, okay? And so we're looking at this posterior view and dividing it into these three longitudinal sections, a lateral section, a medial, and then this midline section right here, okay? So the lateral zone, it tends to be an integrative center. So it does integrate some sensory and cortical, so sensory information coming up or coming in, also from cranial nerves, from some of the visceral stuff coming in, and also then cortical input coming down can influence that. So it's kind of integrative in nature, that lateral zone. It gets both sensory and motor or cortical input. Information from the lateral zone can be conveyed to both the medial and midline zones. So the locus coeruleus projects to the raphe nuclei in the midline. So those are projecting from more of a lateral, from the medial midline zone, then info that conveyed to the medial midline. There's also projections to the cerebrum, cerebellum, spinal cord that adjust general levels of neuronal activity and arousal. So you'll see that in a second. I'll show you that on a picture. The medial zone, so now coming in one zone, a little more medial, it is where some of your vital respiratory and cardiac centers in the pons and medulla are located in this medial zone in the reticular formation. And there's projections to cranial nerve nuclei and the spinal cord, and there's also the reticulospinal tracts actually originate in the medial zone, so influences some of your postural control muscles for that medial activation system. The reticulospinal tracts start in that medial zone. Lastly, the midline zone, that very center, pain control. Raphe nuclei are in there, and they have axons that descend down to the dorsal horns of your spinal cord to inhibit pain at the spinal cord level. The other thing it does is the midline zone is very important for adjusting your level of consciousness or alertness, is through that midline zone. So let's now talk about some of the specific nuclei and neurotransmitters that are associated with these different parts of this reticular formation, okay? So we're going to talk about these, they're called reticular nuclei. So these are some nuclei, groups of cell bodies in the reticular formation, and these neurotransmitters that tend to influence larger overall functions of the cerebrum, but also pain control. So they tend to have axons that project to some fairly diffuse networks of neurons. And you've seen them before, but I'm just going to remind you again about these areas. So the first one is the ventral tegmental area. So this is the ventral tegmental area. It's in the tegmentum of the midbrain. So we're in the midbrain. It's in that middle tegmentum, but it's slightly more towards the ventral part of that tegmentum. A little more front part of that tegmentum versus back part. So it's called the ventral tegmental area. And that actually happens to be right where your substantia nigra is, okay? But that's not the only thing there. There's dopaminergic neurons that project not just for motor function, but project up into your prefrontal cortex here. So this is dopamine going into the prefrontal cortex, which helps with things like motivation, decision making. It also goes to some of our reward centers, okay? And amphetamines and cocaine will stimulate the ventral tegmental area that gives you the high, because it's also stimulating the reward centers that are associated with that. Morphine inhibits inhibitory input to that area. So morphine allows more activity of the ventral tegmental area because it inhibits inhibitory signals to that ventral tegmental area. So that's how you get some pain control because of the morphine inhibiting the inhibitory input, so it gets more excitatory. Excessive activity of that ventral tegmental area can cause schizophrenia. Antipsychotic medications, they block D2 receptors and the dopamine receptors. So if you have, if you're psychotic or schizophrenic, they give you D2 receptor blockers, antipsychotic medication, to decrease the influence of that ventral tegmental or overactivity of that ventral tegmental area. So, yeah. You can have psychotic thoughts. Yeah, it can lead to psychosis if you do too much of it. Yeah. So, I've never tried it, but I'm sure. The also thing, the antipsychotic medications, because you're blocking some of the D2 receptors, they get actually. Remember, D2 receptors are involved with inhibiting the indirect loop. And when you block that, now the indirect loop gets a little active. So with antipsychotic medications, they get dyskinesias. They get too much movement. So you'll see people that are on long-term antipsychotic meds, they get these dyskinetic movements, or they have excessive movement because the D2 receptor blocking. You're blocking the indirect loop. And so now the direct loop is more of a role, and you don't get that balance there between the direct and indirect loop. So they get tardive dyskinesias is what it's called. A tardive dyskinesia is a drug-induced abnormal movement, excessive movement. Is that something on your test today that you're going to have? Yeah. Good. Glad I could help you review that a little bit. We've talked about the pedunculopontine nucleus. This is another nucleus that's located in this reticular formation. So it's kind of in this pons and midbrain junction area here. its main neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. It does project a little bit through this medial forebrain bundle to this inferior frontal lobe area, and it has connections with the globus pallidus and subthalamic nucleus. It's part of the basal ganglia. It connects intimately to the basal ganglia circuitry. If you remember, we showed the basal ganglia. It also not only goes up to the cortex and the thalamus to influence our voluntary motor output, but has connections with this pedunculopontine nucleus, which is important for helping to regulate some of those medial activating pathways for posture. And when that thing gets overactive, they get too stiff. They get that stiffness where they get co-contraction and so forth with Parkinson's disease. But pedunculopontine nucleus exerts its influence via those vestibulo and reticulospinal tracts, those medial activating pathways. And actually in decerebrate cats, if you stimulate that pedunculopontine nucleus, it actually induces a walking type of, makes them walk. It's this nucleus that's a basic nucleus that can create some locomotor function both in cats and in humans. It can. It's not as well defined in humans when you try to stimulate that. But in cats, it can do. Cats have a little more stereotypical. Their walking mechanism is a little less, cortically driven and more brainstem driven. Then we have the raphe nuclei. So the raphe nuclei, these are all in that midline zone. Okay, so the raphe nuclei are right in that central midline zone, and the ones up here, the one that's more rostral, I guess, or superior in nature, you can see it projects to just almost everywhere in the cerebrum. And it primarily releases serotonin, okay, as its primary neurotransmitter. Projects throughout the cerebrum. It may play a role in onset of sleep and quality of sleep. It has a profound effect on mood, the amount of serotonin in your system and these raphe nuclei. Some of your drugs you're going to be tested on today, Prozac may help prevent reuptake of serotonin, so serotonin stays in your neurotransmitters or in your receptors longer. It has general modulation of sensory, motor, and autonomic nervous system. Okay, so it's got, because of such diffuse influence, it can influence lots of different aspects of both sensory, motor, and autonomic system function. And then it also plays a real strong component in that descending pain control, especially the medullary part, the part down here in the medulla, the medullary raphe nuclei. Those project down to the dorsal horn, okay, to inhibit pain information coming in at the dorsal horn. Raphe nuclei. And now we're going to go a little more lateral to the medial reticular zone where the locus coeruleus are located. So locus coeruleus, here's the locus coeruleus here. And then there's also, that's more up in this pons area. Then down the lower pons, this is more upper pons, lower medulla is the locus coeruleus. And then there's a part of this medial, this is called the medial reticular zone nuclei, down a little bit lower, all still in that medial reticular zone, but these use norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter. So these have projecting axons, again, very diffuse through here, both to the cerebrum and then some descending pathways. Norepinephrine projected as brain and spinal cord, most active when you need to be alert. So when you're up and alert, your locus coeruleus is secreting norepinephrine into your cerebrum to keep you alert and awake. This medial reticular zone nuclei have projections down, as well as the locus coeruleus project down to inhibit pain. Okay? So they also play a role in addition to, they complement the raphe nuclei. And the locus coeruleus actually helps to accentuate the effects of the raphe nuclei. So the locus coeruleus has some connections with the raphe nuclei. It helps increase its effect. They're complementary to each other. And then there also is some influence over regulating the autonomic nervous system, the reticular formation, particularly that medial reticular zone. You've seen a picture similar to this. This is another picture showing this. In this case, they show the motor nuclei over here on your left. So this is all the cranial nerve nuclei, motor nuclei, and then sensory nuclei over here that's a little more lateral on the right. But then you got to remember they're nuclei, motor and sensory on both sides, so it really gets into be kind of a jumbled mess. And you'll get to see that here when we start going through cross sections. And particularly when we get down, there's a cross section we're going to do right through here, and you'll see that we're going to see lots of nuclei when we get to that cross section in that. So that upper medulla cross section is probably the most complicated cross section because there's just a lot of stuff that happens to be in that cross section as far as nuclei, pathways, all those kind of things are happening in that area. So we're going to start in the medulla. We're going to go basically start low, work our way up through the brainstem, going cross section. We're just going to do a couple key cross sections through each. These are the only cross sections you have to know. These are the exact pictures you have to know. So these are what you have in your handout for your thing. So let's go through. Again, it's always good before you get into the details to know what's the basic function, what's going on in this region. So here's a nice, let's just step back for a second. Medulla, lower part of the brainstem. What happens there? Contributes to control of eye and head movements, okay, and helping sync those up, so neck muscles and those kind of things. Swallowing, coordination of swallowing, because you've got hypoglossal nerve, glossopharyngeal, vagus, they're all coming out of that medullary region. Helps to regulate cardiovascular, respiratory, and visceral activity, vagus nerve coming out of there, so driving that. So that's what's happening in the medulla, for just very general as you can get as far as functions of the medulla. And we have pathways running through there, sensory motor pathways too, but this is like what kind of functional things are happening in the medulla. So internal anatomy. So we're going to go starting out in a cross section through the low medulla. And we're going to happen to be, this is at the level of the pyramidal decussation. So that's this first cross section is a cross section through the low medulla at the level of the pyramidal decussation. So lower medulla, decussation of the pyramids. First of all, notice it's pretty round in nature because we're almost into the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is fairly round in nature. So we're kind of down on this round looking, because we're kind of transitioning between brainstem and spinal cord here. So let's highlight these. I'm not sure if maybe yellow is better here. So let's go right in order. B, nucleus gracilis. You're just starting to see the beginning of the nucleus gracilis here. And you don't see at this point, you're not seeing the nucleus cuneatus. That's okay. Don't worry about it too much. We're not quite high enough to start seeing these nuclei very well because those nuclei are a little higher up in the brainstem. We're seeing a little tag in of the nucleus gracilis there. Let me just make sure you know, this is posterior, this is anterior, okay? All of these pictures are going to be oriented that way. Also know that if you see a dark stain, that means it's white matter. So it's like a negative. And if it's a lighter color, it's nuclei or cell bodies, okay? So lighter is nuclei, darker is tracts or white matter. That's why B, you see that little bit of lighter, because that's going to be the starting of the nuclei, some cell bodies in there. But we do see a pretty good fasciculus gracilis and a fasciculus cuneatus here. So this is the dorsal columns here coming up. So C right here on each side, that's fasciculus. I should go out just a little farther. Fasciculus gracilis right back here. Fasciculus gracilis. Then we go a little more lateral. In this region here, this is all fasciculus cuneatus. E is going to be what's called the spinal tract. They have E here too, so it's kind of this region in here. Spinal tract of cranial nerve number 5, and F is the nucleus. So what happens is cranial nerve number 5, trigeminal nerve, all that sensory information, pain and temperature from your face, it comes in and fibers descend, right? That goes in and descends down from the pons and down the medulla, even a little bit into the upper cervical spine. Those fibers descending are called this tract, the spinal tract of cranial nerve number 5. Then they make connections with the nucleus as they descend. So that's what you're seeing there is this little tract here, which is the pain and temperature fibers from the face, from trigeminal nerve. They're coming down from higher, traveling down this tract, and they're making connections with the actual nucleus along the way. So F is the nucleus. F is that spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5. G, which is this region right here, that's the posterior spinocerebellar tract, the posterior spinocerebellar tract. H, just in front of it right here, that's the anterior spinocerebellar tract. These guys are both going to go up and then eventually dump into they're going to go into the inferior cerebellar peduncle and go into the cerebellum. Okay, this is down, we're down low right now. They're still working their way up to go into that inferior cerebellar peduncle. That's unconscious proprioception, right, from the upper and lower body. Erase that. Oops. Now L is the pyramidal decussation. So this is the crossing point right here, is the pyramidal decussation. So what's happening here is you have cortical spinal tract fibers running down in the pyramids right here. These are the pyramids. They're going down the pyramids on both sides, front part here. Then they are crossing over to go back to eventually become, M is going to be the lateral cortical spinal tract once you get into the spinal cord. This is the beginning. This is the origination of the lateral cortical spinal tract that's going to be in the spinal cord. So coming down, this one's also crossing over, and this is going to become lateral cortical spinal tract. So this is where the crossing over point is. So they're coming down the front part of the pyramids. They're crossing over and diving back posteriorly to then form the lateral cortical spinal tract that goes down the spinal cord. So this area L is the decussation. You know, that's the crossing point. You do see a few crossing fibers right from the front when you're looking at the front of the medulla here, but this is the pyramids right here. They come and cross over and go back and dive back to form the lateral cortical spinal tract. The last thing on here is O. O is the spinal lemniscus. That's your pain and temperature from the body. Okay, that was your spinothalamic tract, which is anterolateral, and you can still see this O is sitting somewhat anterally and laterally placed in the lower medulla at this point. That's the spinal lemniscus. Remember, it changes names. Once it gets into the brainstem, it's the lemniscus, spinal lemniscus, pain and temperature from the body. Remember, all that information crossed over in the spinal cord before it came up, right? In the anterior white commissure down, you know, it might have gone up and down a few levels before it crossed over, but then crossed over. So this is coming from the opposite side of the body. Lower medulla, piece of cake. Now the one that's a little more of that. This is kind of we're going to do 3 sections to the medulla, then the other ones are just maybe 2 sections through the pons, and only 1 through the midbrain. So medulla is the hardest. So now we're in the medulla at the level of the nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus, and the tubercles there, okay? And this is actually where we're going to have what's called the decussation, the lemniscal decussation. This is where the crossing over from the medial lemniscus is going to take place. So that's why it's called the decussation of the medial lemniscus, or the lemniscal decussation. So we were at the pyramidal decussation in the lower medulla for the motor tracts. Now we're at the lemniscal decussation, or crossing point, for the proprioception, conscious proprioceptive fibers, kind of in the middle of the medulla. So that's what this cross section is about. So here we go. C. Now we see nice big nuclei here. That's your gracile nuclei on both sides. Let me go back to a yellow here. We also have, this is our cuneate nuclei, E, because they're that lighter color. Those are the cell bodies for the gracile and cuneate nuclei are in there. Here is our D, is the fasciculus cuneatus. B right here, that is the fasciculus gracilis. And this is fasciculus gracilis. So that information, that's dorsal column information coming up from lower. It's going to synapse in here to the second order neuron for proprioception. We've got stuff coming up here. This is lower body. Once that occurs, these axons are going to project and go to the other side. So same thing's happening on here. They're going to cross over. They're going to go to the other side, and then they're going to form the medial lemniscus, and then ascend as the medial lemniscus. Remember how the medial lemniscus is oriented more towards this anterior to posterior direction here in this mid-medulla, and then as it goes, it twists. As it goes up, it starts to twist, and you're going to see this. It twists and gets more of a medial lateral orientation, then it keeps twisting a little bit more and gets a little more anterior posterior again higher up. But this right here, this is the decussation. This is the crossing points. This is where, and the same thing's happening here with these gracile fibers. They're all crossing over and then forming our medial lemniscus to ascend up the rest of our medulla into the midbrain. We still see, here we have the spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5. You're going to see this cranial nerve number 5 anywhere you're in the medulla. It's going to be pretty big, pretty obvious, because it's that big nucleus, all that pain and temperature information from the face. Here's the tract of it. This is the little out part, this side out here. This is the cranial nerve 5 tract, because that's those fibers running down to communicate with that nucleus that are coming from that pons, from trigeminal number 5. H, here it is on this side, and then I is right here. That's your anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts. You can't, I mean, you have to imagine them, but they're right in that. You just have to know where they're located. I will have those circled on a test, and it'll have an arrow saying, what is this? And, you have to just know where it's, especially where it's related to, okay, what level I'm at. I'm in the medulla. At the medulla, I'm still going to have, I'm in the mid medulla. I haven't, those spinocerebellar tracts are still there because we're not to where we haven't hit the inferior cerebellar peduncles, because these guys are going to empty into the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So we're still below that level, okay? Because if we go back here, this is your inferior cerebellar peduncles right here. So we're still below that. And actually, your peduncles kind of start right in this region. Here's like a transitionary point. So these anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tracts are going to come up here to go into the cerebellum through that inferior cerebellar peduncle. But we can still see them right here at this level. They're still there. We have our pyramids, our pyramidal tract. So right here is the K. This is our pyramidal tract fibers. Motor tracts. cortical spinal tract fibers running down through the front part of the medulla there. These fibers, here's our gracile and cuneate tubercles. These fibers that are running right here, this M, those fibers right there, at that point they're called the internal arcuate fibers. They're arcing around, they're curving around in that location. That's why they're called the internal arcuate fibers. But that's just your axons from the gracile and cuneate nuclei that are projecting to go cross over to become the medial lemniscus. Then N would be your medial lemniscus on each side. This is your medial lemniscus, which is formed by those fibers that cross over and then to form that medial lemniscus, which ascends up the brainstem and then starts twisting as it goes up, which we'll see when we get to the next levels up. And then lastly, we still have the spinal lemniscus, pain and temperature from the body, and that is J right there. And it's still in that anterolateral region, right? Staying anterolateral. Just got to know that here's I, anterior spinocerebellar, and H just behind it. So these are our unconscious proprioception, pain and temperature, and then here's our conscious proprioception tracts. Then this is all motor tracts up in the front right here. Good times. You got plenty of time to know this stuff, right? You got this. You don't need to know this for another few weeks.
For the exam,
Yeah.
you gonna like let us know like, oh, this is like whatever section of the medulla, or are you just gonna put the picture?
Just put the picture up. You have to be able to recognize. That's your first job. Is before you answer a question, go, okay, what section am I in? And there's usually something that'll help you know that. You know, here the main things is it's still kind of a round feature, but you see these big nuclei back here. That helps you know, versus this one, you don't really see it, you know, a tiny bit right there, but you don't see those big nuclei there. That helps a little bit. Now to the upper medulla, high medulla. This is where we're going to see a lot of those cranial nerve nuclei that we talked about. A little more of the complicated picture here. So it almost looks like a butterfly, sort of. Not quite as colorful as a nice butterfly, but so lots of stuff in here. So let's just start from going down the list here. Back here, this is fourth ventricle. Okay. So we're right here. We're seeing this little area right in here. We're seeing this little depression there. That's the fourth ventricle, that very bottom part of the fourth ventricle. That's what you're seeing right here, is that bottom part of the fourth ventricle. Now we have E out here, most laterally, this nice darkly stained because it's all axons. This is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. If we go back here, so this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and it kind of extends right down into here. So here's your, this is your gracile and cuneate tubercles, and then you have your, anterior and posterior spinocerebellar pathways, but they're going to start diving in, and this is now becoming the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This little ridge right here starts to form and then eventually dumps in. But that's still all kind of considered your inferior cerebellar peduncle. That's going to go up and take those unconscious proprioceptive fibers into your cerebellum to give you that what's going on in my periphery and my joints and my muscles and so forth. So that's what you're seeing, and it's very lateral. So that's what you're seeing right here. It's just the initiation or beginning of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So at this point, we would no longer see an anterior posterior spinocerebellar tract. They've all come together into this inferior cerebellar peduncle. They've moved out into that inferior cerebellar peduncle. So we've lost those spinocerebellar tracts. We still have the spinal tract of cranial nerve number 5 and the spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, because that nucleus is huge and runs all the way through the medulla. So G is the nucleus, the lighter part, then F is the tract, the fibers that are running down, okay, from that trigeminal nerve to go down to communicate and send those pain and temperature signals to that nucleus. So we're still seeing it in that similar location, that little posterior lateral location. We've seen it kind of in the same shot, same region, but now we've just added on this inferior cerebellar peduncle out here. H, this little region right here, and it is somewhat of an ambiguous region, but that's the general location for the nucleus ambiguus. Remember, that's a motor nucleus for some of the cranial nerves, stylopharyngeus muscles controlled there. So some cranial nerves use that for motor function. So that's kind of located right there. This is sort of one of the exceptions to, it's kind of in between. It's not real medial, it's not real lateral. It's a motor nucleus for a cranial nerve. It's kind of in the middle, but it's called the nucleus ambiguus. I, spinal lemniscus. Here's spinal lemniscus. That's pain and temperature from our opposite side of our body. It's still somewhat antero and lateral. The fact that we have these big olivary nuclei, that kind of pushed it back a little bit, but it's still more antero and lateral in nature, okay? So I is the spinal lemniscus. L is the medial lemniscus. Actually, I take that back. It goes all the way, extends all the way up here. It's still in that anterior to posterior arrangement right now. It hasn't started to turn. Once we get into the pons and then the midbrain, it really turns. U, V, W, don't worry about it. That's just showing you like upper, lower, mid body. Don't worry about the somatotopic arrangement in this anterior to posterior arrangement. Don't worry too much about that. Just know L. Just know that whole region is this medial lemniscus. M. Let me start erasing some of this stuff. M, right here. Hypoglossal nucleus. Motor nucleus, it's very midline. That one nicely makes sense. It's medial. Remember, cranial nerve nuclei that tend to be motor tend to be a little more medial. Nuclei that tend to be more sensory tend to be a little more lateral, except for this little nucleus ambiguus. It's a little exception. But here's this hypoglossal nucleus. So that is the motor nucleus. It's going to go send the signals, or the axons originate for your tongue. N is the dorsal motor nucleus of cranial nerve number 10. So that is where the cell bodies that send signals, this is parasympathetic preganglionic neurons. This is motor, visceral motor efferent information. So this is going to go down and drive your gut, all the liver, pancreas. This is where that information originates, or that parasympathetic efferent signals that are going in through the vagus nerve are coming from that dorsal motor nucleus of cranial nerve number 10. P, kind of getting a little more lateral now. So P is just right here. That's the solitary nucleus. So solitary nucleus is a sensory nucleus. That's for your taste, right? For glossopharyngeal and facial nerve, use that solitary nucleus for taste. There is a solitary tract. So some of the fibers that are going to communicate with that solitary nucleus that are coming from glossopharyngeal and coming from your facial nerve run in a little tract, but don't worry about that. I don't have that listed, but just in case you're wondering what that is nearby, that's just the tract that's near it. Now moving a little more lateral, Q is the medial vestibular nucleus. R is the inferior vestibular nucleus. S is called the accessory cuneate nucleus. So all of these out here, this whole group, this is more, those are all sensory in nature, nuclei, where these are more motor, including the nucleus ambiguus in here. So it's kind of like you're dividing them into a little more lateral groups of nuclei versus medial, medial being a little more motor in nature, lateral being sensory nuclei. This whole region in here, that includes the nucleus ambiguus, kind of goes into it. That's all reticular formation. That's all that reticular formation that's in the tegmentum. This whole, all this region in here, this is all tegmentum, tegmentum of the medulla. This front part is more basilar section, but then the reticular formations in here, but the reticular formation can even be divided into further longitudinal zones, that midline, lateral and medial zones. You do need to know you. This little guy right here, that's the medial longitudinal fasciculus. This is the medial lemniscus right here. The medial longitudinal fasciculus down in the medulla runs right along the tip of the medial lemniscus. So that's that pathway that's going down between superior and inferior colliculi, down into the medulla, down to the reticular spinal tracts, vestibulospinal tracts to drive the head and neck movement, coordination with the eyes and inner ears and all that stuff, okay? So that's the MLF right there. And then X, it's actually, you can kind of see little fibers here. This is the hypoglossal nerve fibers that are going to run out right through here. This is that little depression. This is the kind of ventromedian fissure. This is called the ventro-intermediate fissure, and this is kind of called the ventrolateral sulcus or fissure, but it's going to be coming out of that intermediate sulcus right there, hypoglossal nerve. Whew. Thank God we're out of the medulla. Let's take another break after that. Any questions before we? All right, come back in a Pons. Yeah. Oops. Big picture. Major functions. What happens in the pons? There's processing of motor information from the cortex that feeds the cerebellum. Remember, that's those pontine nuclei, those cortical pontine fibers end there and send a copy to the cerebellum. The pontine cranial nerve nuclei process sensory information from the face, so the cranial nerve 5, okay? And if we look at that cranial nerve nucleus and you kind of like make it one big nucleus, it extends all the way from the midbrain all the way in through the pons and down into the medulla. The medulla is primarily associated with the pain and temperature part. The pons is primarily associated with the proprioceptive part of it, okay? So, or the facial part, and the mesencephalic is more the proprioception from the TMJ joint. But we're on the pons right now. So control of muscles of facial expression, cranial nerve number 7, the nucleus is in the pons, the facial nerve nucleus is in the pons. Lateral eye movement, so cranial nerve number 6, the abducens, is in the pons. And then chewing, muscles and mastication are driven by the motor nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, which is located in the pons. So that's what the major functions of the pons. We do have some reticular formation of the pons in there too, so there's some that going on. But so we're going to do, first of all, is a cross section through what we call kind of the mid pons. So it's right in this region right here, and we're just above kind of the middle cerebellar peduncles here, but you can still see a little bit of it up here, okay, that little bit of section there. And that's what you're going to see here. So this is kind of the mid-pons region. First of all, here's the fourth ventricle. You're seeing just that little top edge of the fourth ventricle. If we say go back up into here, remember if we take away this membrane here, that fourth ventricle extends all the way up like this. If we get rid of that little membrane there. So that's what you're seeing right there, is that little bit of the fourth ventricle up there. B, right there, that little bit of the fourth ventricle. D, this little guy right here, This is the mesencephalic nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, although we're not in the mesencephalon. You're seeing the tail bottom edge of the mesencephalic nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, which is actually up in the midbrain, okay? But it tags over, and a little bit of it, transitions into the pons. So that's this little white matter region right here is the mesencephalic nucleus of cranial nerve number 5, the bottom tip of it, okay? That's proprioception from the TMJ joint that goes to that location. E is the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Here's the MLF here, okay? Down lower, down the medulla, remember that the medial the medial lemniscus was more oriented in this anterior to posterior direction. It no longer is up in the medulla. So now the MLF is no longer near it. But the MLF stays in this kind of general region in all the way through pons, medulla, all the way down, okay? It's the fact that now the medial lemniscus, which is this region right here, it's basically twisted. It used to be in this location. It's kind of twisted down to this location as it comes up into the pons. So in the medulla, it's in that anterior to posterior direction, but it twisted and moved a little bit more just kind of out to the side in a more of a medial lateral orientation, the medial lemniscus, when it gets up into this pons. H, this is the superior cerebellar peduncle region. So going back here, this is kind of superior. You're seeing this cross section right up here. This little region, even out into this region, this is kind of superior cerebellar peduncle region. And that's what you're seeing is this top edge where those cerebellar fibers are coming out and going up to project up to the, well, they cross over, I'm sorry, but they do cross over there before they go up. So they come out, and no, they don't. They stay on the same side, sorry. Okay, but you're seeing that little top edge or cut point. That's what this is here, superior cerebellar peduncle. K, and I always do this, I circled too quick. This is the medial lemniscus right here. This little region right here, that's the spinal lemniscus. So the spinal lemniscus is the pain and temperature. And remember, it started out really anterior and lateral, like, it starts as the anterolateral system, so anaphylamic tract. And then as it works its way up through the medulla, it stays lateral the whole time. It starts to move its way back a little bit. And then eventually, once you get up in the pons, and then when the medial lemniscal kind of gets more in this medial lateral orientation, it gets right next to the spinal lemniscus. So at this point, they're all really close to each other. So now the medial lemniscus and the spinal lemniscus are all right next to each other once you get up into the mid-pons. And then they keep staying near each other all the way up into the thalamus and then up into the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So eventually this is where they get close to each other. This is where finally the pain and temperature pathways from the body, conscious, and the proprioceptive fibers are all near each other at this mid-pons level that are coming up. O, it's just this, there's a little region right here. You just kind of have to imagine it. Some of these are imaginary parts, is the trigeminal lemniscus. So there's a little section there for conscious information coming from the face that's going to go up to the thalamus. And so everything here, body, face, and all modalities are close to each other right here. So the trigeminal lemniscus is bringing in information from the face. Sensory information is going to go up to that VPM, ventral-posterior medial part of the thalamus, where the other stuff's going to go to the VPL, the ventral-posterior lateral part of the thalamus. But now, in this low medulla, everything's close together. All modalities of sensation, as well as both from the face and the body, are all right next to each other. And they stay next to each other all the way to the thalamus, to the cortex. Well, they spread out again once they get to the cortex, but because this is all coming to go into that internal capsule and all that fun stuff. The P is, so all the dark stuff in here, all these dark areas, those are pyramidal tract fibers. Those are cortical spinal / pyramidal tract fibers. Those are motor tract fibers running down the front part. This whole region right here, this is all basilar pons. These are all motor tracts running down the front part of the pons. Eventually they're going to narrow themselves down into the medulla and become the pyramids, right? But right now they're a little more spread out in the front part of this pons. Q, all these white areas in here, those are pontine nuclei. Q are the pontine nuclei. And so what happens here is, so let's do this. So you might have a cortical pontine fiber that's going to come here down this tract, but it's going to go over here and communicate with this pontine nucleus. This pontine nucleus is going to cross over to the other side. We're a little high here, but it's going to go through the middle cerebral peduncle. This is the superior cerebrum, but this fiber is going to cross over the other side and go out the middle cerebral peduncle, which is a little lower, so I might have to dive down a little bit. Then it's going to go on the other side of the cerebellum. It's going to deliver a copy of that motor message, because you have cortical spinal fibers are going to run, just keep on, they're going to keep right on going down to deliver the motor message, but some copies of this are going to go to the pontine nuclei, which are going to cross over and send their signal to the opposite side of the cerebellum. So a little shorter list on this one. And then we only have one cross-section through the midbrain. So functions of the midbrain, eye movements, cranial nerve number 3, the nuclei for cranial nerve number 3 are there. Relays for reflexive eye and head movements associated with visual and auditory information, so the tectum, the superior and inferior colliculi are there. Pupillary, consensual, and accommodation reflexes are mediated at the midbrain level. Your substantia nigra is there, so for projecting the dopaminergic neurons up to the basal ganglia. You have some influence of upper extremity movement, especially flexion via the rubrospinal tract that starts there. The red nucleus is there in the midbrain. You have some locomotion and postural reflexes and influence via the pedunculopontine nucleus. The pedunculopontine is partially up in the midbrain, partially in the pons. So this is where the peduncles, the cerebral peduncles, peduncular, that's up in the midbrain. And then you also have an area in the midbrain called the periaqueductal gray. There's some cell bodies are right around the cerebral aqueduct that have project axons down to dorsal horn, to the raphe nuclei to help influence descending pain control and pain inhibition. So quite a lot in that little area of the midbrain. It's a small area, but lots of important functions. So we are going to show you just one cross-section through this, through the superior colliculi. So this is what we're going to see as a cross-section through the superior colliculus. So here it is. So A, there's your superior colliculi, or colliculus back here. C will be the medial geniculate nucleus. Don't worry too much about that. You have a lateral geniculate nucleus that's out here that's been cut off. The lateral and medial geniculate nucleus are the bottom and back part of the thalamus. The lateral geniculate nucleus is a relay for vision. the medial geniculate nucleus is the relay for auditory information that goes to your cortex. I just point that it's been torn off here. You never get a perfect slice, but I will likely not ask you what C is, but I just wanted to point it out so because people always wonder, what is this bump here? Why is it not on this side? It just got torn off. Didn't get a perfect cross section. D, in the midbrain, this whole region here is reticular formation. And that's all in the tegmentum. This is all tegmental region here. This back part here, that's the tectum, okay? E, here's the spinal lemniscus. This whole region here, this is the medial lemniscus. So if you remember, down a little lower, down in the pons, that last section, if you remember, the medial lemniscus was here and the spinal lemniscus was kind of here in that more pure medial lateral orientation. Now you can see it's kind of rotated, so it's kind of rotated even further up into this position now. So it's kind of taking on, again, more of a anterior to posterior orientation because it kept twisting. So, you know, as it starts out in your medulla like this, so if I'm oriented to myself right here, and then it comes up in the medulla, then it twists to this position in the pons, and then it kind of twists more like this again to more medial lateral up in the midbrain. Okay, so that's just, it's ribbon-like, so it's a twisting ribbon basically. That's why they call it the lemniscus. But the spinal lemniscus stays now. The spinal lemniscus has now really moved more posterior. You know, it's really moved posterior. Migrated that direction. This is the H and T. This is the substantia nigra right here. And it's lightly colored stained here because those are cell bodies. Those are dopaminergic neurons, cell bodies, so they're light. Where out here is the, or Z, I guess, is the one we're looking at here. Why don't I have Z on there? This would actually be your crus cerebri right here. This would be where all your motor fibers are running down the front part of your midbrain. Crus cerebri. So really just know Z. This is breaking it down into all the different somatotopically arranged upper body, lower body, all that kind of stuff. Don't need to know all that detail. Just know that this is the crus cerebri and this is motor fibers running down the front part of the brainstem, midbrain. This is a pretty obvious one, this big area here, red nucleus. N, cerebral aqueduct. Okay, that's that connection between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricles going down through the midbrain. That's a cerebral aqueduct. This area right here, O, that's the periaqueductal gray. It's light colored because they're cell bodies. And those are cell bodies that are going to have axons that project down to some of the raphe nuclei and also down the dorsal horns to inhibit pain, another pain inhibition center. Periaqueductal gray. P, let's do Q first. Q is the oculomotor nuclei. Cranial nerve number 3. S is the little fibers. This is the cranial nerve number 3 fibers come right here, and they come out of that interpeduncular fossa. This is the interpeduncular fossa right here between the two peduncles. And then just behind the oculomotor nuclei, there's a little nuclei just behind it. That's the Edinger-Westphal portion. That's the parasympathetic fibers. So this is going to contribute. The parasympathetic fibers are going to go towards helping you with pupillary constriction. okay, and also accommodation reflexes for the lens. R, let's erase some of this now. R is this region right here. This is just the beginnings of the MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus. Because remember, the MLF has to communicate with that oculomotor nerve. We already showed you S was the fibers that come out there. Okay? Midbrain is level of the superior colliculus. Now we get to talk about what happens when there's damage to the brainstem, and it's just a matter of knowing what structures are involved. Okay? We mentioned the 4 Ds of the brainstem. If you have brainstem damage, you will likely have one or more of these. Not always, but you will likely have one or more of these. Trouble with swallowing, dysphagia, double vision, trouble with coordination because of all the intimate connections with the cerebellum, or some trouble with speaking, dysarthria. If you have a large enough lesion in the brainstem, you'll likely get at least one of those. And so when you're looking at cases and that says, you know, that can be a key indicator that you have a brainstem lesion. You usually get a combination of dysfunction, but one or more of those. Other common manifestations that tend to go along with brainstem dysfunctions is difficulty with maintaining vital signs and vital functions. So people with severe brain damage that includes the brainstem will often have trouble regulating their viscera, regulating heart rate, blood pressures all over the place if you damage some of those blood pressure and cardiac and respiratory centers in the brainstem. They'll often have very big problems with consciousness because the reticular activating system, the reticular formation that projects norepinephrine up into your cerebrum, if you have damage to that brainstem, you are unconscious. If you have severe brainstem damage, you typically are lack of consciousness. We already mentioned about contralateral versus ipsilateral signs. So damage to cranial nerve nuclei within the brainstem or the nerve will cause ipsilateral symptoms. If it's in the cortex and part of those cortical bulbar pathways for voluntary control of those, then it's contralateral. The signs and symptoms will be contralateral to the lesion. And also the fact that, remember, there's also, if you have a lesion in the brainstem, that's about the only time you can have, like, this side of my face has sensory problems, but this side of my body has sensory problems. If you have opposite, you know, this sensory loss on one side of the face and the opposite side of the body, that's a giveaway that you've got to have some problem with your brainstem. At least one of your problems needs to be in the brainstem if you've got loss of sensation on one side of your face but loss of sensation on the opposite side of the body. Now we're going to get into the specific common brainstem syndromes and lesions. These are typically associated with specific vascular territories. The most common reason somebody has a problem with their brainstem is a stroke, whether that be a hemorrhagic or aneurysm or a blockage, okay? And these are characteristic blood supplies that we're talking about. However, you can occasionally have tumors that are in these similar regions that give you some kind of a syndrome like that, or not a syndrome like that. We're only going to talk about common syndromes that you're going to see, okay? And we're going to show you, so in your little lab manual, it has the actual, you know, cross section, but then it has this line drawing which helps you see things a little easier. So we're going to use these little line drawings of these cross sections. So this is a cross section through that upper medulla, okay? And so we're going to talk about where the lesion is and the deficits you're going to see and just try to make sense of that. This particular lesion is called a medial medullary syndrome, which is actually a fairly rare lesion to have. It involves damage to, there's the anterior spinal artery is right there. Goes down through the front part of your medulla and all the way down your spinal cord, down the front part. And it has fibers that project here up into this region and supply that. So if you damage the anterior spinal artery or its branches, you can get this medial medullary syndrome. Generally, you're going to have it on both sides. So we're going to show you if you have just on one side, but generally you damage the whole spinal artery, so you'll have loss on both sides here. So you would have bilateral loss of things. What we're going to show you is if you just have one side of a lesion, so you understand what's going on here. I've added here the key, kind of what structures we're impacting here. So let's take a look at this. First of all, you're going to have contralateral hemiplegia. Here you've damaged one of the pyramids. So you have motor cortical spinal tract fibers running down through that front part. They haven't crossed over yet. They're going to cross over. So when you damage this side, you're going to have loss on the opposite side because they have not crossed over yet. So this is going to cause contralateral hemiparesis. Upper and lower body, they're all up here at this point. Okay. You're also going to get contralateral loss of conscious position sense. This is medial lemniscus. Remember, medial lemniscus is oriented in this anterior to posterior direction at this location. So that information crossed over lower, down in the lower brains and medulla, right? At that level of the lemniscal decussation. So proprioceptive information crossed over lower. So we're going to have contralateral loss of proprioception, conscious proprioception. It crossed over down in that mid-medulla. This is upper medulla. So the fact that we have damaged the medial lemniscus here, that's going to be blocking information that's coming from the opposite side of the body, that opposite contralateral loss of conscious proprioception. The good news here is that E is your inferior cerebellar peduncles. Your spinocerebellar tracts and your unconscious proprioception are still getting to the cerebellum. So you actually have okay coordination, but they wouldn't be able to tell like touch localization or very good conscious awareness of proprioceptive sense. And the last thing they're going to have is probably ipsilateral deviation of the tongue, because this often impacts the hypoglossal nerve. So here's the hypoglossal nucleus. Here's the nerve. The nerve runs through that territory, and if you damage and get ischemic in that territory, you damage the nerve. And so this happens to be, if this is the front, this is a left-sided lesion, right? You've affected the left hypoglossal nerve. That hypoglossal nerve goes to the left side of the tongue. So if you ask this person to stick their tongue out, if the left side is weak, the right side is going to overpush. The tongue's going to deviate towards the side of the lesion. It's going to deviate towards the lesion. So you have ipsilateral deviation of the tongue towards the side of the lesion. Medial medullary syndrome. Your book has some pictures of this, but they don't use these pictures. So you will see. So on the exam, there'll be one cross section of a brainstem, and there'll be a lesion, and there'll be a few questions on that. You have to identify what the deficits you're going to see, but it'll be one of these pictures. It'll be these line drawings you're seeing on these slides right now. Yeah. Their tongue would be very, very weak. It'd be paralyzed, but there wouldn't be a deviation. Yes, they'd have a hard time sticking their tongue out. Yeah. And this is really causes kind of that, darn it. Yeah. Some of that, this would create some of what we call that locked-in type syndrome. This is where they would be paralyzed on both sides of their body, because if you wipe out all this, they're paralyzed on both sides of their body. They also have no good proprioception for their entire body, okay, for the most part. They still have proprioception of the face, because the face comes in up higher, but their body would have lack of proprioception. But they have normal pain sensation, so they'd still feel pain. So if they're positioned in a spot that you couldn't move very well, they could still have pain, but they wouldn't be able to move themselves off of that. So this is kind of would lead to some we call this locked-in type syndrome. Any kind of big lesion to the front of the medulla or the front of the pons can cause kind of this locked-in type syndrome. This is called lateral medullary or Wallenberg syndrome. Okay, this is probably the most common vascular territory involved with stroke of the brainstem. So this one you probably want to know pretty well. This happens to affect the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. And we'll do a whole lecture on vascular territory, so you'll feel more comfortable about this, but just trust me, that's the area of the brainstem supplied by the posterior inferior, that should be cerebellar artery. So let's talk about deficits. So you see, we've got lots of stuff in this region that got impacted or potentially impacted by this lesion. First of all, we've got contralateral loss of pain and temperature from the body. This is eye. This is the spinal lemniscus, this region right here. It's potentially impacted by this lesion. Just know that all that pain and temperature has come from the opposite side of the body. It all crossed over from the spinal cord. It's coming up that this is a right-sided lesion, so the left side of my body, I'd have loss of pain and temperature, conscious loss of pain and temperature. However, I'd have ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature from the face because I've impacted, this is the spinal nucleus and tract of trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5. That information is coming in higher. It's traveling down and making connections as it goes along down the brainstem. And so I've impacted this pain and temperature coming in before it's had a chance to make a connection and cross back over to go to the other side. So this is where you're going to get this ipsilateral, the lesion's on the right, the loss of pain and temperature for the face is going to be on the right because you've impacted that nucleus, that spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5 that's integrating that. That information actually goes, this goes a little lower before it crosses over their side, then goes up and becomes part of the trigeminal lemniscus. But don't worry about that right now. They will also tend to have some swallowing problems or a sense of hoarseness when they're trying to talk, or they'll have a loss of gag reflex because you've impacted the nucleus ambiguous right here, which contributes to some of the motor function of the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve for controlling this larynx, pharynx, soft palate. Okay, so you're going to have that be potentially causing some dysphagia, and hoarseness would be a type of dysarthria. If they sounded hoarse, that's a dysarthric type of, and then they have potential loss of gag reflex, and that's the motor part, the efferent limb of the gag reflex. That's the motor part. They may have some nausea and vertigo or sense of spinning or vertigo where the room is actually spinning on them because you've impacted those vestibular nuclei. Okay, Q and R right here. So right here, Q and R, these regions right here. So you've impacted some of the vestibular nucleus. They're receiving that information from the vestibular system, and if you've damaged those, it can cause an impairment there. So they have an imbalance between the left and right side, so that they sense that as dizziness, which can lead to nausea. Okay. They're also going to have ipsilateral ataxia because you've damaged the spinocerebellar fibers. That's because you've damaged this inferior cerebellar peduncle, E. The spinocerebellar fibers are coming up there, right, to go to the cerebellum. So if you've damaged those unconscious proprioceptive fibers, they're going to have some ataxia in their limbs, typically associated with on the same side, right? Because these are ipsilateral pathways, those spinocerebellar tracts. So we're going to impacting this inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is where those spinocerebellar paths are coming into the cerebellum. You are also going to happen to cause this thing called ipsilateral Horner syndrome. And you're going to see this come up with a couple of different of these lesions here. That's if you impact the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. Remember I talked about the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus is that tract that's running from the hypothalamus down through the brainstem. and it's kind of in this region in here. It's in the reticular formation, in the tegmentum, and it's not a defined tract, but it's in there. It's that small, very small tract, but the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus is going down to your innervate your sympathetic nervous system and your thoracic spine, and then also down to those some of those sacral segments. Okay, I'm going to talk about what Horner's syndrome is. It's a cluster of signs that are associated with sympathetic dysfunction because you've lost that innervation over the sympathetic nervous system, and it affects a few key areas. So this is the hypothalamus, and these are axons that project all the way down through this brainstem. This is the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. Runs all the way down until you get to, this is the T1 area here, where you start having the sympathetic fibers that exit out of those upper thoracic areas. The first few thoracic level sympathetic fibers, they actually come out, then they actually go up to go innervate the face and the eye. The sympathetic control of the face and the eye are, because you don't have sympathetic fibers in your cranial nerves, those are only parasympathetic. So this is the sympathetic fibers that originate down in the upper thoracic segments. Their postganglionic fibers then go up and go back up to the head and the eye to innervate your face and your eye for sympathetic control. But if you damage this down in the medulla, that dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, it just impairs that sympathetic control of the face and eye. So what you see here is, this is kind of the classic Horner syndrome. It's on this side we're seeing is that you lose, there's a few parasympathetically innervated fibers, Mueller's muscle, that helps elevate the eyelid, so you get a little bit of drooping of the eyelid because you lose some sympathetic innervation there. The pupil is constricted on this side because your sympathetic drive to the pupil is no longer there, so it's only parasympathetic. And so you get, remember, parasympathetic causes constriction of the pupil, sympathetic is dilation. So you don't have the sympathetic drive to balance the parasympathetic, because normally they balance each other to keep your pupils in a midpoint. Then you can constrict or dilate by how much sympathetic versus parasympathetic activation. But you're going to see this pupillary constriction on that side. And you also might see some problems with, lack of sweating on that side of the face too, because you don't have sympathetic innervation of the sweat glands on that side of the face. Is not working as well. So this is Horner syndrome, is this combination of this drooping eyelid, constriction of the pupil. They also can't do their accommodation reflex as well, though parasympathetic's more for that. And then also maybe some dryness and lack of sweating on that side. Animals can get it too. This is actually a Horner syndrome in a dog. Their eyelid, they blink upwards like that. So this is the eyelid not being, it's a little bit droopy, but it's drooping up in a sense. And the pupil is a little bit more smaller here versus this very wide open pupil there. So thought it was curious. I didn't know that dogs could have it. So you're going to see, if you see Horner syndrome, that's all we're talking about. That just means that that DLF has been affected, that goes and supplies and helps modulate the sympathetic outflow to the head and face. Now we're medial pontine syndrome. This is a section of the pons, a cross section you have not seen before. These are the middle cerebellar peduncles right here. This is all cerebellum sitting back here. This is actually the dentate nucleus back here. So we're at the level of the middle cerebellum. This is really kind of right smack in the middle of the pons at the level of the cerebellar peduncle. This is because of damage to the paramedian branches of the basilar artery. So the basilar artery sits right here. This is the basilar groove. This is the basilar pons. There's these branches called paramedian branches that are just on the medial. The most medial aspects of the pons are supplied by these paramedian branches. and that's the territory it supplies. So what we're going to see with this, deficits, contralateral hemiplegia. So this region here, a lot of these are motor fibers running down through the front part of the pons, cortical spinal tract fibers. If you damage a decent part of that, you're going to have contralateral hemiparesis, right? So the opposites, they're going to cross over down the medulla, contralateral hemiparesis, upper and lower body. Contralateral loss of position sense and vibration. Here's the medial lemniscus right here. Remember in the pons, it's mostly in this medial lateral orientation. This is the medial lemniscus here, medial lemniscus here. So if you're impacting the medial lemniscus, so you're going to get contralateral loss of conscious proprioception, vibration, position sense. Whole opposite side of the body, upper and lower body, because everything's together there, upper and lower body. Pain and temperature is okay. Here's L. This is spinal lemniscus is sitting right here. It doesn't get affected, so actually pain and temperature is okay. Their entire body is okay. Pain and temperature, spinal lemniscus has not been impacted on either side here. It just hits the medial lemniscus. You will also impact the abducens nerve and abducens nucleus. This is the abducens nucleus sitting right back here. And there's the nerve running out here. So you could impact not only the nucleus, but the nerve. So they're going to have lateral rectus weakness. Lateral rectus weakness, abducens. So their eye is going to be sitting probably a little more medial at rest because they don't have it balanced. Lateral rectus has been kind of wiped out. They're going to have trouble. They can't track their eye past midline on that side because they can't move their eye out because lateral rectus is gone. So they're not going to be able to move their eye ipsilateral to the lesion. You may also impact paralysis of conjugate gaze, especially towards the side of the lesion. So this little Q right here, this is the MLF, the medial longitudinal fasciculus right here. You've damaged the medial longitudinal fasciculus. That helps coordinate that conjugate eye movement. And so because you've damaged the one side of the MLF, your eyes aren't going to move together very well, especially towards the side of the lesion. So they're going to have double vision. They're going to have diplopia, most likely, when they try to move their eyes. Plus, because of the lateral rectus, their eye is going to sit a little more medial, where this eye is going to be straight ahead. So these people are going to have double vision, too. So you might want to add that double vision to this medial pontine syndrome. So we're at the same level here of cross-section. Now we're in the see your faces are just done. So we're a little bit behind, but we'll have some time, I think, to catch up too. But let's just see if we can get through lateral pontine syndrome here. So lateral pontine syndrome is going to be more in this region. And this is going to be because of long circumferential branches of the basilar artery have been damaged. Basilar artery here, we just talked about these paramedian branches. But there's also these long circumferential branches that go back to supply this posterior lateral portion. If those get damaged, or there's an aneurysm right there or something like that, then that's going to cause this lateral pontine syndrome. They're going to be ataxic. This middle cerebral artery and the fibers running through here to go to the cerebellum are going to be impacted. Just know that you impacted the cerebellum and the middle cerebellar peduncle. So you're going to have ipsilateral ataxia. They may even fall towards that side of the lesion. They tend to just kind of walk and kind of fall to that side too. But they're going to have ipsilateral ataxia because of damage impacting the middle cerebral peduncle and those fibers. They're likely also to have some vertigo, nausea, possibly some deafness, because in that same region you may impact the vestibulocochlear nerves and nuclei can be in that region too. Because this lesion isn't just, it's not like this little lesion that's just at that level. It extends up and down a little bit. So you have to realize that this is extending down, maybe a little bit into the upper part of the medulla and a little bit up too, so it's going to impact more than just what you see in this cross-section. You're going to have ipsilateral paralysis of facial muscles. This is the facial nerve nucleus right here. Facial nerve is a weird nerve. It actually, the axons project posteriorly, wrap around the abducens nucleus before coming out. They descend down and then come out of the pontomedullary junction, but you're impacting the nerve and the facial nerve nucleus. They're going to have weakness on their side of their face, on the ipsilateral side of the face, because you've impacted that side. You've damaged the nucleus and the nerve itself. So ipsilateral facial paralysis. You will likely have ipsilateral paralysis for the muscles of mastication because you're impacting the motor nucleus for cranial nerve number 5 in this region as well. I don't think I have it on there. You don't see it on there. No, I don't see it on there. But remember, again, this lesion extends up and down. You just kind of have to know. You also have ipsilateral Horner syndrome because that DLF is running somewhere in this reticular formation, and we're going to have that Horner syndrome we just mentioned in the last thing, that cluster of signs and symptoms associated with Horner syndrome. You will have ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature from the face, so that's, you've impacted that spinal nucleus of cranial nerve number 5 right there, so that's information coming in from the same side of the face that gets blocked here. But you'll have contralateral loss of pain and temperature from the body because here, with this lesion, this is the spinal lemniscus right here. This is medial lemniscus. So you'll notice medial lemniscus is relatively untouched, but spinal lemniscus is wiped out. So pain and temperature, contralateral body is impacted, but proprioception's good. These people don't have numbness. They feel like, yeah, I can tell where my limbs are in space. You test their sensation. They don't have true numbness, but they don't feel pain and temperature. Okay, so they don't feel sharp and dull. Well, they feel dull, but they won't feel the sharp part of it when you try to poke them, and won't feel temperature either because of that. But it's contralateral because all that information, all that stuff's crossed over in the spinal cord. You've also typically with this lesion also impacted the MLF. Here's the MLF on each side back here, that Q. So that also causes that loss of conjugate gaze. Hard to get your eyes to sync up when you wiped out or damaged one of the medial longitudinal vesiculus on one side. Okay, let's stop there. You guys you're done. My voice is done. Yeah, don't feel like you got to know this all right now. It'll take some time to absorb it. We'll have time to practice. We'll do cases, all that kind of stuff. Recognize the syndromes is what you're looking for here, that kind of that cluster of symptoms.